When you mix a song, do you sometimes feel that every time you add a plugin, things start to fall apart a little bit? Or maybe you're not sure if the plugins you're adding are making things better or worse? In this video, I want to share 3 quick plugin rules to help you get the sound you're looking for faster than ever. And stick around until the end. I'll show you exactly how I set this up in a session. In case we haven't met yet, my name is Joe Gilder. I've been running this channel, Home Studio Corner, since 2009, and my goal is to help you make music you're proud of in your home studio. So let's talk through how to think through plugins, because plugins are fun. They're super fun. Might be one of the reasons you got into this to begin with. You saw somebody using some cool plugins on the screen and you thought, I would like to push those buttons. That was me. So what do we talk about today is 3 ways to better approach the way that you use plugins so you can get the sound that you want and move on and get done with the mix. Because nobody really wants to just mix all the time. They want to mix because it helps them finish the song so they can release it to the world. So I want to help you do that. The first piece of advice I have for you, the first rule of plugins, is don't start with plugins. Hear me out. When you're working on a mix, it is very possible, and I've seen this over and over again with my students, it's very possible to start grabbing plugins way too early. What I teach is to first, after you set up your session, do a static mix. So only set the levels up and down, and the panning left and right of all your tracks. This might take 5 minutes. It might take 30 minutes to an hour. No matter how long it takes, it's time well spent because you're setting the balances of everything. You're making sure that the volume of the drums makes sense relative to the bass and the guitars and the vocals. You're making sure that I've heard it so many times where people will do their static mix and they'll rush through it and not do it well. And so there'll be certain tracks that are just way louder than everything else. And then they go start slapping on plugins trying to fix those imbalances. That's not a plugin problem. That's a level and a balance problem. So put on your big boy pants, have some patience, get the balance right before you allow yourself to grab your favorite set of plugins. Now, just to clarify, I'm talking about mixing plugins here. If your guitar tone depends on a guitar amp plugin, of course, leave that on. Let's use some common sense here. But when I'm talking about things like EQs, compressors, and things like that, hold off until you've got that balance right. Then you're going to be working with good material, and your plugin moves will come together a lot more quickly. A quick note about rules. There will be someone who says there are no rules. Okay, fine. These are my rules. These are the guidelines that I use, the boundaries that I set for myself to allow me to be productive. So, rule number 2, have a reason for every plugin that you add. You need to know why you're adding this to the mix. Or at least, bare minimum, you need to know what it is about the sound that you don't like. So you could say, this guitar just doesn't feel right and I think it's muddy. That's good enough. I'd probably reach for an EQ in that situation. Or these drums just aren't punchy like I want them to be. Then I might reach for a compressor. Now, this isn't to say there's no room for experimentation. You got a new plugin, you want to just slap it on there and see what it sounds like. I'm all for that. But where people get lost is where they say, I think I'm supposed to put a compressor on this, and then they do. And then they just say, I think I'm supposed to set the threshold and ratio and attack to these settings. And then they don't really ever listen. And they don't even really know why they're adding it. They don't know what they don't like about the sound. And they don't know how to identify a good sound when it arrives. So they end up in this eternal mix session that just the sounds just change but never get better. Instead, a better approach would be to stop and say, okay, what is it about this bass guitar? First of all, is this bass guitar working? Does it sound great in the mix? Because the answer might be yes. The answer might be no plugins needed. Move on. I love it when that happens, and it happens more often than you think. But then if you say, no, there's something about it I don't like, the next question is, what is it? Or what's my hypothesis about what it is? You may not know for sure, but you might have an inclination. That's all I'm talking about. What is it about this bass? Describe to me what you don't like about it. And then what tool are you going to use to try to fix it? You may try 4 different tools before you find the right one. That's okay. But having a bit of a purpose to what you're doing will make your mix sessions move a lot more quickly and have a lot more of a focus and a flow. So when you get done, let's say you have an hour to mix, at the end of that hour, you can say, okay, I have accomplished something versus, oh boy, I think I made that worse. By the way, the stuff I'm sharing with you is stuff that I've learned over the years from thousands of mixes and critiques and spending a lot of time doing this, finding out what works for me and what doesn't. That's where this is coming from. Over the years, I've developed a system for recording and producing songs, mixing songs, and mastering songs. And now I follow that system every time I work on one of those things, and it helps me get consistently great results every time. I can teach you that system. It's all inside of something called the Simple Music Production System. You can check that out at homestudiocorner.com/simple. Before we jump into rule number 3, a quick story. Several years ago, I attended an event. It was called Audio Bloggers Live. My friend Ronan Chris Murphy put on this event in a theater I think it was in Santa Monica, California. I was one of the presenters, Graham Cochran, Ian Shepherd, and then they brought in several big name producers and engineers to do interviews and things like that. It was a fun day. The thing that stands out the most to me from that day is Ian Shepherd's presentation. If you're not familiar with Ian, he's a mastering engineer. I've learned just about everything I know about mastering, I learned from Ian. He's fantastic. And he did a presentation where he played 2 clips for us, 2 versions of a mix, A and B. And he asked the audience to listen to them. He played them a couple of times and then tell us what we heard that was different in B versus A. Hands shot up in the room. People started yelling out answers. People that I respect and trust, like Graham Cochran. And they would say things like, the second one, B had more low end. B was punchier. B was brighter. B had more dynamics. And all these answers came out. So the first question was, did you hear a difference? And we all said yes. And then he asked, what did you hear? You want to know what the difference was? 1 decibel. That's it. B was 1 dB louder than A. That 1 decibel difference was enough for us to hear a different EQ curve on the track itself. Now, was some of that placebo? Maybe. But it demonstrates a point. The volume at which we listen to something will have an effect on how we hear it. It's a whole scientific thing, Fletcher-Munson curves and all that. There's an EQ curve that changes based on the volume of the source. So if I take a mix and I crank it and change nothing else, even though it is technically louder, my ears will technically hear more low end because of this weird phenomenon that happens. So why does that matter? Well, there's this thing that happens. I think we're born with this innate sense that something louder sounds better. So if we hear one guitar that's louder than another, we will tend to think that it's better. I worked in audio retail for a few years, and one of the things that people will do when they're demoing speakers, let's say, they'll have their speaker and their competitor's speaker, and they'll play music on both and switch between them. But sometimes what they'll do is they'll make their speaker just a little bit louder than the competitor's. Why? Because that loudness is perceived as it being better. So what ends up happening is this one could sound worse, but because it's louder, we kind of knee-jerk reaction think that it's better. Well, guess what? The same thing happens when you use plugins in your mix. Anything you add to a track usually will change the volume of that track. If I add a lot of compression to something, it's probably going to turn things down. That's what compression does. If I add a bunch of EQ boosts, it's going to turn up the volume. A bunch of EQ cuts is probably going to turn down the overall volume. So the net result is the track that we're working on is at a different volume now than it was before. I was talking about the static mix recently in an email, and someone replied back and said, if I do the static mix and I get all the levels right, won't that not matter once I start adding plugins because the plugins are going to change the levels of everything? And I said, that would be true if you're not using plugins the right way. What is the right way to use plugins? For me, the right way is this third rule that we're going to talk about, which is a big time game changer for me and my mixes. Always level match your plugins. In other words, make sure that if I bypass this plugin, the overall volume stays about the same. There are exceptions to this. For example, in mastering, one of the things we do is add a lot of volume in mastering. That's an exception. But when we're talking about mixing, let's say some guitar tracks, when I bypass the plugins, I want it to sound roughly the same volume. That way, I'm comparing more apples to apples, and I'm able to hear what did I do to the actual sound versus did I just make it louder or quieter. So I want to give you an example. I'm not going to show my screen yet, but I've got a pair of guitars here, and I'm going to play an A and a B for you, and I want you to think, which one do you like better? Okay, here we go. For a lot of people, the answer to that question would be, I liked B better because B was louder. Let me show you what you were hearing. A on these guitars was this set of plugins, some compression and some EQ. B was this plugin bypassed. So this is technically two plugins. So this was A and this was B. B was louder. The bypass plugin was actually louder. But if we level match them, we can do a better comparison. So what do I mean? I mean, when I turn this on and off, I want it to be roughly the same level. If I've got this compressor involved, that makes it really easy. I just adjust this output level. Sometimes it's called makeup gain, to make sure that the final product of this is at roughly the same volume. So if this is the before, and I want to make that roughly the same volume, I'll listen to it, then I'll turn the plug in, and then I'll adjust this one to make it roughly the same volume. Now we can do a fair comparison. What did we actually change on the sound? Let's do it again. We'll start with the plug-in off, and then we'll add the plug-in in, see which one you like better. It's a much more fair comparison. They're not as different as they seemed to be before. And we can tell with the plugin, I think the plugin version is a little bit better. Thinking in context of this is going to go into a pretty dense mix, I don't need that extra woofy low end. It sounds great while you're recording, but once it's in the mix, I don't need all of this stuff down here. All of that. It's cool. I'm glad it's there, but I don't need it in the mix. Thank you for your service. So I would pull that out so these guitars don't interfere and muddy up the mid-range, because there's going to be a lot of bass and kick drum and toms and things down there. So this net result is a better sounding part for the mix. But if I left it with the weird level indifference, I would end up being like, first of all, I don't know if I'm doing any good. Second of all, I wasted a bunch of time adding plugins and then made it quieter so I can't hear it as much, so I add more plugins to try to hear it better, ergo making the sound worse. And then the net result too is I end up with a mix that's not balanced well, because now the guitars have disappeared. Or I've left in frequencies that I didn't really need to leave in, but because the level matching wasn't happening, I didn't catch it, and I'm constantly looking around saying, where's that low end mud coming from? Oh, it's from that guitar that I didn't level match appropriately. Does that make sense? I need to be able to hit the bypass button and hear it at roughly the same volume so that I can really compare the two. If they're at different volumes, even a couple of dB, I'm going to think the louder one will sound better to me. Having them at the same volume allows me to make a more fair comparison. A couple of questions people will have about this. First of all, some plugins have an automatic makeup gain mode or an automatic volume compensation mode. What about those things? They can be handy. I found that sometimes they work well, sometimes they don't. I prefer to do it by ear, just using the makeup gain, the output gain of an EQ, for example. Another warning for you. This is both art and science. The temptation will be to go all science on it and start trying to exactly measure the before and after volume so you get it at the exact decimal within the 100th decimal place of matching the volume. That's not the spirit of this. You're trying to just get it in the ballpark. I know we talked about this starting off with a story about a 1 decibel difference, just to demonstrate that differences in volume matter. So make sure you're setting it at a roughly the same volume so you can do a better comparison. When there's a big volume difference, it's almost impossible to really tell which one is better. Set it closer together. There will be plugins that don't allow you to do this. So keep that in mind as you're using them, and either just be very diligent about the way you use those plugins. For example, some EQs, like this EQ here, it doesn't have an output volume. So I compensated up here with the compressor that I also wanted to use on this sound. If I only had this EQ, I just have to keep in mind the EQ'd version is going to be a little bit quieter, and I may need to increase the volume of the guitar to get it back to the level that I wanted. Or perhaps put a gain plug-in after this EQ to compensate for the levels that I pulled out by cutting all those lows and low mids. Don't get super hung up on I have to match it precisely, accurately, and use a special tool to do that. It's just a matter of be aware of it and then just use your ears to make sure before and after are roughly in the same ballpark. Why? We already talked about one reason why. Second reason is you've already done your static mix. You've already decided these things are really balanced. Now you're going in and doing things like EQ and compression to further balance the distribution of frequencies, but you want to maintain that core static mix balance that you set up early because that's really the heartbeat of the song. If every plugin you add changes that level, then by the time you've added all the plugins you want to add, your mix is all out of whack or all cattywampus, one of the two. And that's no good. So by following this and being disciplined in the way that you add plugins, you won't tear apart your mix no matter how many plugins you add, because before and after will still be in the ballpark of that same volume that you set before. All right, that's it for this video. If you like what you see here and you're not ready for my mixing course that I showed you earlier, you can have my free 5-step mix guide. Just go to 5stepmix.com to get your free copy. And if you like this video, you'll love this video I did recently on how to EQ anything. Thanks for watching. See ya.